Good evening, everyone. My name is Russ Ganim, and I am the Dean of International Programs here at the University of Iowa. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's installment of the Global Alumni Spotlight Series. Before I introduce tonight's guest, Geoffrey D'Souza, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Global Alumni Spotlight Series and its purpose. The Global Alumni Spotlight Series was founded about a year ago to showcase the career accomplishments of our domestic and international alumni who have led distinguished careers abroad. The fields have always varied in terms of areas of expertise. In the past, we've interviewed experts in the field of business, also government, public health, as well as education. And tonight's guest overlaps in several different fields. Geoffrey D'Souza was born in and raised in Davenport, Iowa, and received a Bachelor of Science degree in political science from the University of Iowa in 2001. He served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine from 2002 until 2005, teaching English in the rural mountain village of Dubove for 2 years, and then the town of Kulash for another year. Geoff received a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Michigan with a focus on education policy in 2008. Longing for a return to international life, in 2011, he went back to Ukraine, where he spent almost 7 years in the western city of Lviv, primarily teaching English at a language training center. But he also took on additional teaching work at the Ukrainian Catholic University, and also worked in a few IT offices, as well as a call center. In 2018, Geoff left Ukraine for China, where he spent a year in Beijing teaching English at a public elementary school. He also taught for 2 years in the city of Anyang in a private middle school and returned to Beijing, where he taught at a private middle school before deciding to permanently resettle to the US in March of 2022. And so, Geoff, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's conversation. We're very grateful to you for sharing your time and experience with us, because you've got a wide range of stories to tell in Ukraine and in China. And while the primary focus will be on Ukraine, because we are still trying to keep the public's attention on Ukraine and the war there. It broke out, as we know, in February of this year. Many things have happened since then, but we don't want to lose sight of what's happening in a very, very important part of the world that has implications across the globe. But before we talk about Ukraine and also your experiences in China, we'd like you to tell us a little bit about why you came to the University of Iowa and why you decided to study political science.
Yeah, well, originally I attended Drake over there in Des Moines. I had gone to a small Catholic high school where my graduation class was 37, so I thought I'd be better suited for a smaller college. But it wasn't the right fit for me. I transferred to Iowa because it was closer to home. I wanted a real college experience. Tuition back then was like $4,500 a year. One of the best bargains in America. That played a big role. Big Hawkeye fan as well. But yeah, in spite of the size, I never really felt like I was lost in the crowd. I loved my experience at Iowa. And the reason I chose political science was in 1996, I was following the presidential elections for the first time. And I was following the issues, and I found it kind of fascinating. And I kind of got input from my family, and I said, what do you think? And they said, you should major what you have passion for. And I can't say that I'm big into politics today, but it was definitely something that I had a huge passion for when I decided to declare it. So.
Very good, very good. And then so in terms of international engagement, because that's been sort of a major thrust of your career up to this point, we know that you're very interested in political science, that you're very interested in public policy, but what drew you to international experiences? Did you travel a lot when you were young? Did you meet people from other parts of the world that you found interesting and wanted to learn more about? Tell us a little bit about, how you became globally oriented.
Yeah, well, my dad was actually born in Kenya. And as a matter of fact, when he was a kid, he had a peaceful volunteer. My grandfather worked at the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi. And so, my dad, he immigrated to America at 18, attended Parsons College, which is closed now, but then transferred to Iowa. He sort of always taught us to appreciate and love what we have in America, but not to forget that there's a whole world out there. And so, yeah, I would say I was raised fairly, with that in mind. Now, with the exception of a couple trips to England and one to Scotland as a teenager, I had never been abroad, actually. It just kind of fell in my lap. But basically, my junior year of college came to an end, and I had to decide what I was going to do after graduation. Grad school was always in the cards, but I didn't want to go right away. And so Peace Corps kind of intrigued me. I knew it'd be something challenging and useful to do. Look great on my resume and give me a chance to really experience the world. But yeah, I never really intended on a international kind of expat career. Yeah, I fell in love with it, and that's basically what I've done for most of the past 20 years.
Well, thank you for that, Jeff. Could we ask you to turn up your audio a little bit? I think
Okay.
some of the folks have had trouble hearing. Maybe I'll just back up a little bit, Jeff, and because you were talking about your family's experience, right?
Sure.
And so again, I heard you mention your parents, your grandparents. Maybe you could just quickly summarize kind of their experience and how it connects with your interest in international engagement.
Yeah, my grandparents were actually born in Karachi.
Okay.
Yeah, my father's side, back when it was before independence of India.
Right.
And there was a lot of trade going on between India and Kenya, both being part of the British Empire, and a lot of Indians settled in places like Tanzania and Kenya, and that's where my parents went in their 20s. And yeah, my grandpa had a 40-year career with the U.S. Embassy. My grandma taught at a Catholic school, and they raised 11 kids, 10 of whom immigrated to America, and then one immigrated to Canada. So they're all over here.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
Wow. And so was it your father or your grandfather who was at the U.S. Embassy?
My grandfather worked.
Grandfather.
So what? We have a picture of him with Robert Kennedy.
Oh, how cool is that? Yeah. Wow. And what did he do there?
I don't know exactly what he did with the embassy. I just know he was well respected, and but yeah, he was actually even featured in National Geographic in the 1960s. They did some kind of article on, I don't know if it was on Kenya or whatever. I can't remember, but we do have the issue. And so, yeah, he was kind of considered someone who was kind of in the loop on, American-Kenyan relations, what do you want to say, And so, yeah, that had a big impact on me. My dad coming over and kind of living the American dream. He's a dentist, and actually he teaches at the university on Tuesdays.
Oh, great.
And so, yeah, I would say they were a pretty big impact on my decision to kind of have an international life.
Definitely. And so, you graduated from Iowa and then you joined the Peace Corps, right? Was that right after you finished your studies at Iowa, or was there like a little bit of a lull? Yeah.
Well, basically, I was invited to Turkmenistan.
Okay.
And we got there 2 days before the September 11th, 2011. And then they evacuated us. I was kind of back to the drawing board. A few months later, I got invited to Russia Far East. But then for the first time in the program's 10-year history, the visas weren't issued on time. And I figured something had to be up. And so I got out of there as quickly as I could. I didn't think we were going to go. And sure enough, they ended up canceling the program. And basically my placement officer kind of took pity on me. You don't normally get to choose the country, but because I was 0 for 2, he said you can go to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, a couple others, and then he said Ukraine. And I just thought, okay, I'll give Ukraine a try. And that's just kind of how it went. That's how I ended up in Ukraine.
And so did you have any language training before you went?
Not before, although it's kind of funny. This is 2002, so they still sent us a cassette with some basic Ukrainian stuff, like conversational Ukrainian, some folk songs and things like that. They switched to DVDs like a year later, and of course now, of course, they don't need to send you anything. But it is kind of quaint that I still got the cassette. But there was no training before. But when we got there, there was 3 months of intense training. They put us in a host family in these far-flung villages. My family didn't speak any English, which was precisely the point. So yeah, we had 6 days a week of language and cultural training, 6 hours a day. We had breaks on Sundays. But yeah, it was pretty intense. When I got to the village, they didn't really speak pure Ukrainian. They have their own very unique dialect. And so it was kind of back to the drawing board again with that. They would try their best to speak Ukrainian with me, but amongst themselves, like in the teacher's room, they were all speaking their own language that a lot of Ukrainians don't understand. It's a very unique dialect.
Very good. And so my guess is that you've stayed in touch with a lot of the people that you knew from back then. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I guess I wanted to ask what you did in the Peace Corps and how that sort of shaped your career and how it shaped your knowledge of Ukraine, both back then and now.
All right. Well, I taught in a rural, in a public school in a rural community up in the mountains. Back then, you were actually allowed to choose which site you wanted to go to. I felt a little bit guilty about being in Ukraine when you could definitely be in a lot more challenging places. Ukraine had McDonald's. So I said, if I'm gonna be in Ukraine, put me in the most difficult place you possibly could.
Sure.
I was an hour away from the nearest town. We didn't have mobile or internet connections. We didn't have gas during the first month of winter. In my apartment, you could hear you could see my breath when I'd go into the kitchen. It was literally a temperature outside. But yeah, we also didn't have things like copy machines and things. I had to use the blackboard. I had to really use my imagination. Which really benefited me. It's benefited me for the past 20 years, especially when you think about like younger generations of students, of teachers in their 20s who are so used to technology. I know this is kind of going off topic a little bit, but just a few months ago in China, we had a malfunction of our screen in the classroom, or a power outage or something. And so I had to whip up a 60-minute lesson just without the use of anything but with a piece of chalk. That was no problem for me, But I would imagine a teacher in their mid-20s might have a little more difficulty coming up with ideas without access to that kind of stuff. So that was definitely beneficial. It was great to be in a place like Global. I was the first American most of them had ever met. I think I like to believe I gave a lot of hope to a lot of kids who, a lot of their parents were abroad. A lot of the villages were just grandparents and kids. And so they didn't have much, but they kind of understood that English was sort of something that they could use for their future. And I definitely had a lot of kids who, it's been 20 years. They're now in their late 20s, early 30s.
Wow.
Some of them told me that they were inspired to, take careers connected to English because for the first time in their lives, my lessons kind of stirred passion in English, whereas before they had kind of found it boring, So yeah. And then I extended for a year, actually. because I loved my experience.
Wow.
And they don't let everyone extend, but if they feel that, hey, this person, because I'm taking up a spot that would otherwise go to a new volunteer.
Right.
They took the decision pretty seriously, and they said, yeah, you know, we felt pretty good about what you did. So they put me in a town of about 60,000 with a specialized English school, with a tradition of sending kids to America for high school exchange programs. It was a big difference, you know, but they were both really enjoyable experiences in their own ways, you know. But yeah, so I had a really fantastic experience in Ukraine, which explains why I ended up staying as long as I did.
Exactly. And so, as a teacher and just as someone, living in Ukraine, what would you say were your greatest triumphs and your greatest challenges?
The school set, I kind of had a very charmed kind of situation where both schools that I had were extremely supportive of me. There were other volunteers who really struggled with their administrators, with their coordinators. Mm-hmm. They had a really difficult time. But my schools, they supported me 100%. If I had problems with kids, they would actually just take the kids out of the classroom and in some cases banish them from the classroom. Mm-hmm. Like they just, wow, like, yeah. So it's really hard for me to say what my challenges were in the school itself, because they were just fantastic. I've had difficulties in the community, being, you stick out like a sore thumb in a village where everyone's kind of calling out your name and you don't know who they are, but they all know who you are. That's a really surreal experience.
For sure.
Unless you're a celebrity, you don't typically have people come up to you and say, "I know who you are." I had a little more anonymous. I was more anonymous in Kalush, luckily, but the challenges were loneliness, I would say, being in the village, and the bitter cold in winter, but I, in spite of all that, I think in general, and I had a landlady who would come unannounced. In Ukraine, you don't need to give 48-hour notice. You just show up.
You just show up. Okay.
You just show up. You don't show up with a key. You don't even knock. You just open the door and you're just there. And those were those little issues that I had to deal with, and I did deal with those. But for the most part, no, I had very few conflicts or issues at all while I was in Ukraine. They all treated me great.
Oh, that's certainly wonderful to hear. So we will get back to Ukraine in a second, but I want to remind everyone that they can send questions via the Q&A function. We've already gotten a few, so feel free to do that at any time during the interview. And also, after your experience in Ukraine, or your first experience, I know that you went to the University of Michigan to pursue a degree in public policy. So tell us why you made that decision and how it impacted your future career decisions.
Yeah, well, I always knew I wanted to do grad school, and I felt Ukraine would be the thing that kind of pushed me to that point. And there's something called the Paul Coverdale Fellowship Program, where returned Peace Corps volunteers, they get these huge tuition discounts and scholarships and things like that. So I had looked into that. That was kind of the thing I was really focusing on. Mm-hmm. But at this time, this was 17 years ago, Duke was really the only school that appealed to me. Now, not to say these other schools aren't good, but I wanted something really good. I felt if I was going to go to grad school, I wanted to go somewhere where I just felt like I was really proud to be there. And I considered Duke, but then I thought, forget about the fellowship program. Peace Corps started in Michigan. And, did you know about that?
I did not know that. Yeah, that's really interesting.
During his campaign, he met with all these students, and he was like notoriously late to these things. And he was like 2 hours late. It was like 11 o'clock or something. And the students were still there. And he told them, if you can show this kind of dedication towards me, we need to come up with a program where you can show off your skills to the world. So he announced in Michigan that he was the first law he signed when he became president was Peace Corps. And so that was kind of the thing, I'm a Hawkeye, but I had kind of dreamed of the idea of going to Michigan. And yeah, I got in. It was the only place I applied to. There were no safety schools, but it all worked out. They liked my experience, and I guess I charmed them at the interview or something. But the reason I chose public policy, it just felt like a proper extension of what I was kind of doing as a Peace Corps volunteer.
Mhm.
I could take sort of doing something good for others and making a career out of it. So that's really why I chose public policy. Uh, Education was something I had also considered, like a master's in education. But again, there weren't any programs out there that appealed to me. But yeah, so that's how I ended up in Michigan. They are now, they do have a fellowship program with Peace Corps now.
Right.
And yeah. So that's kind of how I ended up choosing Michigan. So.
And so for our listeners who might not know much about public policy, what does it entail? Does it look at sort of legislation on the federal, state, or municipal level with regard to, say, business, education, healthcare, transportation, things like that? Or how was the program at Michigan structured?
Right. Well, I think that's kind of the beauty of public policies. You can kind of choose which path you want to go. The two major tracks were domestic policy or international policy.
Okay.
Right. So basically, it's kind of funny. I chose domestic policy because I thought I was going to do education policy. I had fully intended to stay in America. I had done an internship with Governor Granholm of Michigan, and I really liked all of that stuff. Oh, but anyways, so essentially we were split into two groups: those who were doing domestic and those doing international. And there were certain classes that we were all kind of together in. But then there were also, the required classes where it depended on which track you were going. And so since I chose domestic policy, we focused on domestic issues.
Very good. And could you tell us a little bit about your internship with then Governor Granholm, who is now in President Biden's cabinet?
Yeah, that's right. No, that was a lot of fun. I had to commute every day from Ann Arbor to Lansing, which is more than an hour. Now, gas prices were not $4.70.
Right.
But they were like $2.50 even back then.
Right. That's and that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, my wife's originally from Michigan, so she's from Lansing, and so shuttling back and forth between Lansing and Ann Arbor it's not a picnic.
It's not, but I did really have a lot.
Okay,
I sublet. But anyways, so I commuted every morning, got up at 6. For a while, I shared a ride with another student. That saved us on gas. I worked for Sue Parnell. She was their education policy person. And my main project that summer was just to look around at different schools around America and how they implemented there's a program they wanted to introduce that allowed you to get your associates in 1 year. So basically 4 years of high school plus 1 year of community college instead of 4 of high school and 2. So basically sort of fusing your last year of high school with with community college. So you have your associate's degree in 5 years instead of and that. So she was kind of looking for different programs around the country. Oh, had they succeeded? What did they do to kind of put it in place? So that was kind of my main project that I did with one of my colleagues. You could say another intern. So, but yeah, it was a lot of fun. We got to meet her a couple times, and so yeah, it was pretty awesome.
No, that sounds great. And then, you did return to Ukraine in 2011, and you held a lot of different jobs at that time, education, tech, some others. So what prompted your return, and tell us about your work experience at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing was technology had changed so much. when I lived there in 2002, I mean, it was so hard to get an internet connection. Most Ukrainians didn't have internet. Even if they did, they wouldn't know what to do with it. There weren't a
Yeah.
lot of practical applications back then. But it was like just boom. Like no one had internet in 2006, and then suddenly everybody had internet in 2008. Like within a 2 year period, like Ukraine had suddenly become like America in terms of like everyone having Wi-Fi, everyone having computers in their home, and it just made it easy for me to communicate with everyone, that I had formed strong connections with. And so through my networking and everything, it suddenly became feasible to go back to Ukraine. I don't think I would have been able to just go back under the previous conditions where, I mean, I had visited like in 2007 and no one knew I was coming for a visit because I had no way of letting them know.
I see.
Someone,
Wow.
some were on vacation, and they're like, if we had known you were here, we would have, gone to Odessa another day. Well, anyway, so that was the huge thing is suddenly, I had these opportunities. I had a friend actually, she picked me up at the airport. I stayed with her and her landlady for a week. Gosh, it was so nice to have someone to crash on the sofa with, after a long ride. None of that would have been possible without having this networking, without, and, she made phone calls to schools and stuff in advance because they either didn't answer emails or they didn't really take them seriously.
Right.
So she was of a huge help. So yeah, that was kind of what happened, and I got a job. It's called American English School, and I still remain in contact with them. I was with them for all 7 years in different capacities. I was a full-time teacher at one point, and then I started cutting back. I was getting other gigs, and I was doing a lot of editing and proofreading, and doing a lot of web content. And so, yeah, I was able to do pretty well for myself. It helped to have the connections, and Ukrainians are always looking for native speakers to help with projects and stuff, but they don't know where to find them. And it's hard just to solicit. It's hard just to either randomly or even just write an American that they know and say, hey, would you have time to devote to this? Most don't. I mean, they have jobs in America, but I was there in Ukraine. I was looking for work. So hey, we have this guy who we can kind of give our work to, and so yeah, that's kind of how I was able to make it succeed. When it would be a lot harder if I hadn't had all that Peace Corps experience.
Right, and you sort of had to create your own network and your own sort of communication plan, right?
Exactly.
Because internet wasn't necessarily widespread, or people weren't paying attention to email. It came a little bit slower to Ukraine than it did maybe other parts of Europe, for example. So you were relying on, personal contacts that you had made, but also you probably just wrote some letters and made some phone calls and kind of stitched together your support group in the old-fashioned way, right?
Yep. For example, Ukrainian Catholic University. I thought they probably have some opportunities. They're strongly connected to Canadian organizations, and so I just showed up one day and I said, "Hey, like, do you have any teaching gigs?" And they did. And also, I taught at an IT company, and the CEO was actually one of my ninth graders.
Oh wow!
15 years earlier.
Talk about things coming full circle. That's that would be ironic.
So I was their in-house teacher, and so that's yet another opportunity that would have been harder, if you didn't have those kind of contacts. So
for sure. And so we'll continue talking about Ukraine, but we don't want to forget about China and your experiences there. So, what prompted your going to China? What did you do there, and how did it compare to Ukraine? Was it a big adjustment? It must have been, at least at the outset.
Yeah, well, yeah. One of my Ukrainian friends, she graduated from university, and she says, "Hey, let's go to China. What do you think?" And I thought, sounds like a great idea. I was looking for an out. Like after 7 years in Ukraine, like it was time for me to move on. I think I had done everything I needed to do. And so we moved to Beijing, and I taught at like you had mentioned, I taught at an elementary school. Yeah, I would say it's quite different from Ukraine on a few levels. In China, they really, 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 really want foreign English teachers, at least pre-COVID. And so, gosh, like, I mean, a better comparison would be China and Japan, because I had considered Japan as well.
Okay.
If you want a teaching job in Japan, you have to go to Japan. You have to go to the school yourself and sell yourself to them. You have to
Mhm.
basically solicit the job. That's
Yeah, I
really
see.
hard to do. And
Sure,
how do you
sure.
just go into a school and say, you guys need teachers in the fall? But in China, they have this extensive, like, they have agencies who do all of the work for you, and they're basically begging you to come over there. And they do all the paperwork for you. They find the schools for you. They interview you on their behalf. Like, they just do everything, and you sign a contract with them, and they're your support to the whole process. It's extremely well developed the way they do it there, and they pay really, really well. And to any young teachers out there, I honestly recommend. Well, if this whole COVID thing goes away there, because it's really hard to get to China right now, a couple of years in China is a really great idea. The classes are a lot of fun. You get to really work on your lesson planning skills. You get to pay off your student debts because you get a great salary. They pay for your apartment. They pay for your food. Uh, the only thing I paid for was on the weekends.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, because I got three free meals a day. And so, my goodness, like, that's a really great way to pay off student loans and get a lot of experience. And they pay about the same as entry level Iowa teacher. So anyways, so yeah, in those ways, it's quite different from Ukraine. In Ukraine, there are no contracts. They can't guarantee your salaries.
Hmm.
Yeah, they're not quite developed to that extent at all, actually. You know, but then yeah, in terms of cultural, yeah, I mean, Ukraine and China, of course, are difference between night and day as well.
Right. And-
It wasn't easy. I felt a strong connection to Ukraine, and I enjoyed my time in China, but I didn't feel the same kind of strong connection.
Right.
They treated me well, but yeah, it was harder for sure for them to
Sure.
relate to me and for me to relate to them.
Did you learn any Chinese? How did you adapt to the culture there?
Yeah, not really. I mean, beyond just a few basic things.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I do feel like most people, if you're going to go abroad, out of respect, it probably is a good idea to learn a few words and things like that. But yeah, I really didn't. My focus was on teaching, which I love, and making good money while I was at it. That was kind of the thing.
Right. No, I think that definitely makes sense. But it sounds like it's something that you would recommend
I
to
absolutely would recommend it.
new
And
teachers. Yeah.
I did come back in March because of the war in Ukraine. It was emotionally difficult for me. But I did fully intend to go back in April. I was going to go back in April, finish my contract in July,
Hmm.
but the COVID restrictions are so extreme. It's it's just impossible to get back there right now.
Right.
I have no regrets about leaving, but I do regret that I wasn't able to go back and finish my contract.
Right. And realistically speaking, because we just hosted a delegation from the Chinese consulate in Chicago this afternoon,
Hmm.
they said that at the earliest things are going to start to open up, with respect to travel in China next year. So it's
That's
going to
only
be a few months yet. I mean,
I
that's,
don't believe that.
yeah. I
If they're
mean,
really going with their zero COVID policy, I don't know. I mean, I know they're supposed to reelect President Xi in October, and it's possible once that happens, he will relax the rules a little bit.
mhm.
That's what I've been hearing. That's possible. So maybe, you know.
Right, right.
But I'm done with China. I think I've done what I needed to do there. But I definitely recommend it for students. In fact, the school that I work for, I still have good connections with them, and
Mhm.
they're hoping that maybe I can help persuade students to go over. So I told them at some point once it becomes easier, then definitely, I'd like to set something up, maybe give a presentation to students who might be interested in working abroad, teaching abroad. I'd be happy to do that once they start opening up, restrictions.
Right. Well, we very well may have you come talk to some of our
Yeah,
newly minted graduates. And
yep. The school has materials and all sorts of things, and they've been really wanting me to do this. And I'm telling, I'd love to,
yeah.
but we're gonna have to wait until the rules are a bit easier. But yeah, I'd love to do that because I strongly recommend it. Going to China for a couple of years, 2-3 years, it's well worth it.
Very good. Very good. So let's pop back to Ukraine, and we were talking about your return in 2011. Let's maybe fast forward to 2014 and the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea by Russia. Because what we're seeing in Ukraine is to a certain extent, I wouldn't necessarily, and I'm no expert on the matter, but it's not necessarily a repeat of what happened in Crimea, but it's very similar. We have, I think, understood Putin's aggression toward Ukraine for quite some time. We in the West didn't really do anything about it in 2014. Now, obviously, there's very strong and united resistance. But tell us about, the reaction sort of on a macro level when you were in Ukraine to the Russian annexation of Crimea, and then on a micro level, that is to say, within your town, the people that you knew, and how they responded to this aggression.
Well, gosh, I mean, when it happened, so many things were happening all at once, because as that was happening, of course, the revolution had taken place in Kyiv. There was a lot of euphoria over having overthrown Yanukovych. He's a pretty ruthless guy. And then suddenly this thing happens in Crimea. And yeah, a lot of my friends, of course, were worried at that time that it was going to become a full-scale war.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, it didn't, because Ukraine was not prepared for anything. I mean, that's why they were able to take over Crimea without a single gunshot. I think Putin thought that the same thing would happen now. Russia in 4 months has only occupied one major city. That's all they have. That's all they've gained since they started the war. That tells you a lot about how Ukrainians are resisting. So yeah, I mean, there was fear. I actually took. I can speak, I think, more on a micro level, actually, because
sure.
When I from Yalta, and one of my roommates in Lviv, and his parents stayed in Crimea after the annexation, and he couldn't go down there to see them because he could be conscripted into the Russian army. And his parents, they came and visited once, but gosh, they had to go through all sorts of hoops to get up there. They're all gone. I mean, they're all in Kyiv now, or in Lviv. Most Ukrainians, I think, have left Crimea. I had heard by next year, all Ukrainian citizens will have to replace their passports with Russian passports. Otherwise, they'll lose their property and everything. So there was actually a time where Ukrainians could still technically live in Crimea as Ukrainian citizens. I actually met a girl in China who has a Ukrainian passport. She was able to go to Crimea, but that's all going to change next year. And so, my friend was personally affected by this, So, yeah, it's unfortunate because it was their home. And yes, even though most people in Crimea spoke Russian, most of them had grown up understanding that they were part of Ukraine and being perfectly fine with it.
Right. And, the notion of Ukrainian identity goes back centuries, if not millennia. If you look at things from a linguistic point of view, a literary point of view, in terms of, art, music, Ukraine has had, and Ukrainian identity has had a strong presence for ages.
Yeah,
And right,
the fact is, if 44 million people identify them as Ukrainians, you don't have a right to tell them, no, you don't, that you're not a culture, you're not a nation. You know, so yeah, that's absolutely true. Kyiv is centuries older than Moscow.
hmm
You know,
right. And I guess, maybe just to get back to Crimea for a second, do you see the annexation and the invasion of Crimea as as Putin's response to the defeat of basically his puppet in Kyiv?
well, I mean, it was spurred by it, but we all know now that he had been planning that for years.
Okay.
So it wasn't just some kind of spontaneous action. He even admitted after going all this time that first denying that Russian troops had anything to do with it.
hmm
He eventually did the complete opposite and said, not only did we do this, we've been planning this for quite some time. I always feel like at some point that it was always Putin's aspiration to take over Ukraine. I mean, back in 2006, he was in Austria giving this horrendous speech about Ukraine not deserving to exist as a country.
hmm
At the time, people were concerned, but
Right.
nothing more. Those were red flags, and then he invaded Georgia. So I mean,
Right.
we didn't respond back then either.
Right. Because the West didn't do anything when Georgia was invaded, and didn't do anything when Crimea was invaded.
No, that's right.
So, if you're in Putin's shoes, you're saying, well, why wouldn't I, invade Kyiv? Why wouldn't I invade Kharkiv? It's make perfect sense. Obviously, he overestimated the strength of his army. And he probably underestimated, this time around at least, the response from the West.
Yep, and obviously the response of Ukrainians, because
Right.
he thought that he thought Ukrainians would just welcome Russia with open arms.
Mm-hmm.
When he said that Ukraine was being held hostage by President Zelensky, I think he truly meant it. When he gave this speech, he was telling Ukrainian soldiers, put down your weapons, walk home, and also help us overthrow your government. Like this, as if this was an army that just needed someone to tell them, to give them that sort of the reinforcement that they need to overthrow the horrible, horrible government that's controlling them. Putin, I really don't think understands democracy and doesn't understand that the people really, they recognize the flaws of their government, but they've also held their governments accountable. Ukraine is the only former Soviet country that has given 3 presidents the boot.
Mm-hmm.
Their first president was lost re-election in 1998. And of course, Yushchenko lost re-election in 2010. And then Yanukovych, of course, lost in the revolution. And so it's a flawed democracy, but it's still kind of a democracy. Ukrainians still expect accountability, whereas evidently Russians don't.
Exactly. And so, were you, even given this history and given Putin's pronouncements, where he's saying that Ukraine doesn't really exist, it's not a country, we're here to liberate you, were you still surprised by the invasion, and were your friends in Ukraine surprised by this aggression?
I was shocked that he decided he's just going to take the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
That just I think that blew everyone's mind. Even his own advisors were shocked.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, this is a country that's the size of Texas, and the further west you go, the more fervent people are in terms of their cultural identity and their passion for their country. I mean, when back in the 1950s, when the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia, they did it with a force of I believe it was 250,000 Warsaw Pact troops. I mean, by comparison, I think Putin was sending 150,000 to a country, multiple times larger than Czechoslovakia was.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I didn't, and I still don't see the logic. And as we're seeing 4 months later, he's made very little progress. He hasn't even taken over the Donbass, and that was supposed to be the easy area where everyone, they have like 40% of them are ethnic Russians. They all speak Russian there. That was supposed to be a piece of cake.
Right. And parts of the Donbass were already occupied, weren't they?
That's right. The 11% of the country. It's a small sliver, actually, of those two oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk. The rest fought off, the Russians and collaborators.
Right. Well, no, this is very, very illuminating. And so, Jeff, we have some questions from the audience, but before we get to those questions, I do want to ask about your background. It's an absolutely beautiful image. Can you tell us what it is?
Right. So this is the Lviv Opera House. Lviv, of course, is the westernmost major city in Ukraine. It's about an hour and a half away from the Polish border. This was actually built in I believe it's like the 1890s, when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And for about a year, I lived in an apartment, actually just over there across the street. If you live in a place like Lviv, you basically walk by the opera house every day, because you can't get from point A to point B without going through the city center. So if anyone ever makes their way out to Ukraine, Lviv, by the way, just like anywhere else in Ukraine, they have alarms going off, and occasionally there's a missile that hits. Generally, it's been hitting actual legitimate strategic areas, but for the most part, Lviv is pretty safe. Ben Stiller, the actor Ben Stiller, was in Lviv a few days ago. He was hanging out in the part of the city that I've gone through hundreds of times. Angelina Jolie was there, So actually, and there's a student at Iowa. He's currently in Western Ukraine now doing humanitarian stuff.
Right.
And so,
Very good. And I see that the Opera House is illuminated in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, both blue and yellow. And my understanding is that the blue represents the sky, right? And that the yellow is the fields of grain and wheat and sunflowers.
That's right. Ukraine is the breadbasket was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. And by the way, Russians are bombing fields, and they're sending grain in eastern Ukraine down to Syria. They're actually, it's pretty awful. Some of those other things that don't get reported as much. It's not just simply, obviously targeting the cities and stuff is pretty horrible, but these other things that they're doing as well, putting mines in the fields and just flat out bombing fertile farm fields.
Right, which is causing food shortages in Africa and in the Middle East.
That's right.
This could very well contribute to a global recession that will hit some parts of the world more severely than others. And so, in terms of one of the questions, we have an attendee who asks, how can we support Ukraine and its people as the war progresses? So we've put some websites in the chat. People can certainly access them. This particular Global Alumni Series or Spotlight Series will be recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, so you can obviously go back to the conversation and consult the links. But maybe, Jeff, from your particular perspective, how can people help? Because we're going into the 5th month of the war. Now, some analysts are saying this is going to become a war of attrition. It might last months, if not years. So we know that military and humanitarian aid are pouring in, but this has to be a sustained effort. So what, in your opinion, can people do to help?
Right. Well, I'm wearing, this is in, oh no, you can't see it, can you? You can't see it.
If you, yeah, there we, yeah.
Right. So this T-shirt, it says Iowa za Ukraine, which means Iowa for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And I bought this online, and all proceeds went to charity. In this particular case, it was designed by 3 high schoolers in Des Moines. 2 are Ukrainian, 1 from Kyrgyzstan. And this particular fundraiser was for some maternity hospital in Kyiv. And so, there are targeted opportunities like that. But then, of course, there are broader ones. For example, donating to Ukrainian Red Cross, the World Central Kitchen. There's also Global Giving. It's called the Global Giving Ukraine Crisis Relief Fund. Those are some options. There's also there are Facebook groups. There's what's it called? Iowa. Is it called Iowa for Ukraine? Oh, Iowa Stands with Ukraine. And that's a good one because it also offers a whole variety depending on what you want to accomplish. They have, traditional Ukrainian meals that serve as fundraisers. And then occasionally you'll get a post from someone who says, I have a friend of a friend, they're raising money for a vehicle for the war effort. So, it really kind of depends on where you want your money to be spent.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's essential that Ukrainians get money both for refugees that are both displaced in Ukraine and also the ones who are out of the country. And then, there are also options to help fund the war effort itself, because that's also extremely important. Night vision goggles, boots. One of the, just kind of a quick story here, Ukrainians have superior boots compared to the Russians. They're ventilated, so they're comfortable. And in fact, Russian soldiers have been complaining that Ukrainian boots are so much better than ours. And these little things make a difference, actually, in terms of morale, And so the fact that Ukrainians are getting high quality boots, things like that are really important. So, yeah.
Very good. And, at least in terms of the war effort, were you surprised at how successful the Ukrainian army has been up to this point?
Not just me, but I think most American intelligence experts and all the pundits. They said Ukrainian was going to fall in 2 days. Kharkiv, that's the second biggest city in Ukraine. It's only 30 miles away from the Russian border. They've had no luck whatsoever taking it over. Resistance has been huge all over the country, but even near the border. So, I was terrified, of course, but I see that Ukrainians are fighting hard because they know there are no other options. They're fighting for the right to exist. This isn't just a simple case of we're just going to annex you, and you can live your lives, but you're just going to have to live them within our new borders. Putin has said that Ukraine shouldn't exist as a culture. We've seen atrocities taking place. We've seen, the term genocide should never be taken lightly, but there are cases in these little towns outside of Kyiv where civilians were being tied up, tortured, and executed. There's nothing, no other explanation other than genocide.
Right. Well, in Bucha, for example, we've seen examples of genocide. And you're right, it's not a term that can be bandied about lightly, but if you look at the definition of genocide, at least as it's written or as it is promulgated by the UN, Definitely, crimes against humanity and crimes against peace have been committed by the Russians against Ukraine.
Right. And the only major city that they've occupied is called Kherson, and it's down south near Crimea. They're rounding up Ukrainian English teachers and history teachers, and they've been bombing museums, and they are trying to eliminate Ukrainian culture.
Right.
Speaking Ukrainian is enough to be considered an enemy of Russia. And so that's what we're dealing with here. That's what people need to understand. That this isn't just a little spat. This isn't just a thing of, well, if Ukraine just surrenders now, we can avoid even a wider conflict and everything will be fine. It's just like Ukraine needs to just, be nicer to Russia or whatever arguments are being made, It's literally Ukrainian, their history is at stake here.
Right.
Their right to exist is at stake.
And then, so the final question from a listener is this: who do you think is winning right now?
Yeah, I would absolutely say Ukraine is winning the war. I don't think there's any argument even among Russia that they failed during the first phase. It's weird how they try to spin it and say, "Oh no, we always intended to not win the war in the first phase." Then the second phase it's concentrated in the east mostly, and they've been inching a little bit, but it's been more than 2 months now, and they still haven't taken over those two oblasts that they had, the 8 years ago. The two major cities had been occupied. They're no closer to getting Odessa or Mykolaiv or any of those places down south. I would say absolutely Ukraine is winning, but they need to continue to get what they need, in terms of weapons and equipment and everything, so that Russia will finally say, forget about this. This is more than we thought we could handle. Let's just have peace.
Very good. Well, listen, Jeff, we can't thank you enough. Your career is an inspiration. It is a model to our students and our alumni. We appreciate you defending the Hawkeye colors, as it were, in singing the praises of the University of Iowa and serving as an ambassador for our state and our university in both Ukraine and in China. And we hope that others will follow in your footsteps. That is to say, join the Peace Corps, go into education. I've posted some comments from a viewer who says who was talking about opportunities to teach English in Poland. So this is a great way for, I think, our students who maybe have just graduated and are looking for maybe some next steps. They want international experiences, have an interest in teaching, have an interest in other parts of the world. And this is a good sort of transition that can lead to some really, really interesting experiences. And maybe just one final question is, Jeff, what's in store for your future? What do you have planned within the next months?
I should say, if not for the war, my next plan would have been to go to Croatia. It's easy for Americans to go there. You can stay there for a full year without a visa, and you can just hop across and go back in. They're really trying to get expats to come in. What are they called? Digital nomads.
Okay.
And with all my contacts, I could find myself plenty of work to do online. So that was kind of the plan. It was a beautiful city called Split, which is across from Italy. But for now, I'm going to wait till things simmer down, hopefully, but for now, I'm doing freelance writing at Upwork. I'm teaching online lessons to Chinese kids. through my school, they still kind of, they put me in touch with the students.
Right, right.
That's kind of what I'm doing right now. As for the future, we're just gonna kind of see how things go.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Jeff. This was a real pleasure, and we're very grateful to you for sharing time with us. And we have delighted in learning about your experiences. I'll also thank the audience for tuning in, and then just note that this conversation has been recorded. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next few days, and we'll be sure to send out a notice on social media once the conversation is ready for viewing. And so with that, I will wish everyone a pleasant good evening and hope that your summer is going well. So take care, everyone. Thank you again, Jeff.
Right,
Thank you again,
everyone.
audience, and we'll be in touch. Alrighty,
All right,
bye-bye.
bye.